And so the last story that I want to talk about this week, of course, I always finish off with the UFC. And I gotta say, this upcoming weekend is one of the most hotly anticipated championship rematches in UFC history for so many reasons. And this one in particular, I mean, obviously one reason why this is going to be so hotly anticipated is because it is the UFC's, finally they are returning to a live audience, to a live American audience, in Jacksonville, Florida. They have sold, I think the last number I heard was something like 25,000 seats. 25,000 seats. 25,000 tickets to see the rematch for the Welterweight Championship of the world. Jorge Masvidal versus Kamaru Usman 2. It is as every bit as personal as it has ever been. And this time around, Jorge, he is finally getting a full camp. The last time he wound up taking this fight, and it wound up being about, by the time that you factored in all of the quarantining and all the stuff that had to be done in order to have this fight happen on Fight Island and the United Arab Emirates. It wound up being, I believe, total about 6 days to train, 6 days to cut weight and do all of that stuff. He had to cut something like 22 pounds in 6 days. And of course, when he showed up for that fight, he showed up looking very flat. And so really, I think that both fighters went into that fight knowing that the challenger had a built-in excuse. And it's pretty obvious that he did. There's no denying that. And so this time around, there will be no excuses. And so one thing that Chael Sonnen has said while he was going into talking about this stuff is that really both of these guys have gone all in on this. And so there is one guy walking into this, and he's the champion. Kamaru Usman, he is the champion. He is the welterweight champion of the world. But he's not the star that he thinks that he should be. And as the welterweight champion of the world, he should be a very big star. But really he's not, and I think that's because a lot of people have had difficulty accepting that Kamaru Usman is who Kamaru Usman says that he is. Now, after this last fight, his last title defense against Gilbert Burley, that was a question that I asked going into that fight. And I think that he answered it, and the answer is an emphatic yes. Kamaru Usman is exactly what he tells everybody that he is. There's no doubting it now. Absolutely none. Realistically, maybe a person shouldn't have doubted it in the first place, but a lot of people did. And so that's the Kamaru Usman side of it. Jorge Masvidal, what he brings to this fight, Kamaru Usman, he's bringing the championship. Jorge Masvidal, he's bringing the stardom. He is the star that a lot of people assume that Kamaru Usman should be. And he's not the champion. And so both of these guys, they're basically pushing it in. And as Chael Sonnen has said that, whoever walks out of this fight, they are going to be the champion and the star. And the other guy is going to walk away empty-handed. Now, personally, I'm not really convinced of that. I don't think that Jorge Masvidal has to win this fight to remain a star. I think that he's going to remain a star no matter what. His philosophy and his style and everything that he brings to the fight, not just the fight itself, but in the lead up to the fight, that's what makes him the star. Losing a championship is not going to change any of that. But one thing that it will cast into some doubt is his credibility. In order to be a star of that magnitude, you do credibly have to be able to be a champion. And a lot of people are going to have that question. And the thing about it is that Jorge Masvidal has actually gambled that quite a bit over the last year. He's gambled that credibility quite a bit with some mixed results. And so more recently and more famously, he had some background involvement in this boxing match between Jake Paul and Ben Askren. Now, before I go any further with that, let me just acknowledge that, they are marketing that as Jake Paul won the fight. I don't actually think that has any legitimacy to it. I can tell the difference between a knockout and a knockdown, pretty easily. That was not a knockout, that was a knockdown. It was a knockdown that the ref called a TKO, and I think that probably there was somebody in his ear, maybe even in his pocket, that was basically telling them, it's like, call this fight at the first chance that you get. Call it for Jake, the first chance that you get. And of course, if Ben had gone in and knocked out Paul clean, well, then there would be no getting around that. But I mean, in boxing, you knock a guy down, you're supposed to have a standing count. If the guy gets right back up, just basically like he gets knocked down, he's like, oh, and he gets back up, well, then that fight is supposed to continue. But instead, that referee seems to have taken that as an opportunity to call the fight for Jake Paul. Unfortunately, these are not things that are unheard of in boxing. It is, it's a corrupt sport, with a very troubled, competitive architecture, as Chael Sonnen would phrase it. So quite frankly, I don't recognize this at all. As far as I'm concerned, Jake Paul has 3 amateur wins, over guys that are not boxers, and he has 1 professional no contest. In my record books, that's Jake Paul's record. I don't recognize this win. Now, Jorge Masvidal, he actually had some background involvement. He actually helped train Jake Paul a little bit. And it was pretty obvious why he did that, and that is because Jorge Masvidal does not like Ben Askren whatsoever. I'm not even convinced that he necessarily likes Jake Paul, but he definitely does not like Ben Askren, and that was because, quite frankly, Ben Askren showed up in the welterweight division in the UFC. He was a bit of a loudmouth, and he was talking about Jorge right off the bat, and Jorge's the kind of guy that you don't just walk away from that. You don't just get to walk away from the trash talk, take a picture, and have the whole thing be over. You have to, there has to be a reckoning. You have to account for your words. And so famously, he got that running knee knockout victory over Ben Askren. Maybe one of the most famous UFC highlights of all time. I mean, it really is amazing. And if you're not a UFC fan and you haven't seen it, you should go watch it. It might be enough to make you a fan of this sport. I mean, he got his win, but he didn't let it go. He kind of held on to that. Because a couple years later, he's right back at it. He's helping Jake Paul train to fight Ben Askren. And who knows, I actually have a suspicion. It's not impossible that maybe Jorge Masvidal was the guy who put the idea of Ben Askren in Jake Paul's head in the first place. But regardless of how that whole thing came to be in the first place, the one thing that we can't really look away from is the detail that he took a huge gamble there. He was not quiet about his involvement. He was actually out telling people, he's like, yeah, I'm helping Jake train to fight Ben Askren, because I don't like him. I don't think he represents the sport well. And so he was taking a little bit of a gamble there. Because if he goes and he helps Jake Paul train for this thing, and he's out in public and saying, it's like, yeah, I endorse Jake Paul to go beat up Ben Askren. If Jake Paul goes out at that point and he loses, that takes some of Jorge's shine away. I mean, circling back to to some of the ideas associated with pro wrestling, I mean, basically what Jorge was doing was he was giving Jake Paul what they call the rub. Kind of giving him some of that shine, trying to help him to become a bigger star. So if he gives Jake Paul the rub and then Jake Paul goes out and gets smoked, well, that doesn't really look very well for Jorge. But the interesting thing about this is that, I mean, that's only the more recent episode in which he's done that. So previously, he was pretty vocal about helping Tyron Woodley train to fight Colby Covington. Now, the history between Jorge Masvidal and Colby Covington, it could be, it could be an entire podcast. As a matter of fact, if you have a chance, go check out Mixed Molly Whoppery's videos, I should say, on Jorge Masvidal and Colby Covington. They are all fantastic. He tells the story really well. But Jorge and Colby, they don't like each other. They used to be really good friends, but now they're they're bitter enemies now. And so when Colby Covington was fighting Tyron Woodley this last year, Masvidal came out in public and he said, I'm helping Tyron train striking, because he's going to go in there and he's going to whoop Colby. And of course that wound up not being the case. I mean, not only did Colby go in there and beat Tyron, but he actually broke his ribs. So Jorge had gambled a little bit of his credibility on Tyron, and Tyron didn't deliver for him. I think that a lot of people probably should have looked at that and said, well, is Jorge, what's he doing here? I'd probably take him a little bit less credible after that. But more recently, it's worked out to his advantage. I mean, a little bit more to his benefit. I mean, Jake Paul, he went on and he did, get what, this Triller organization is calling a professional win over Ben Askren. So just for the purpose of argument, let's treat it for the purpose of argument as if it's a real win. Obviously that works into to Jorge's corner. But really, Jake Paul, the one thing to keep in mind about him, and where this definitely does not work out in Jorge's favor at all, is that Jake Paul is a bit of a snake. So not only is he enough of a snake that he came out and he actually kind of tried to he tried to claim a win over Mike Perry, over a sparring session, which violates so many codes within MMA. To even be out talking about a sparring session as if it's a victory, you're not supposed to be doing that. You're not supposed to be doing that in MMA. You're not supposed to be doing that in boxing. But then after the lead up to the fight, I don't believe this was after the fight. As I understand it, this was before the fight. Tyron Woodley was backstage and somebody had a camera on him. And Jake Paul and one of his trainers, were basically kind of taunting Tyron Woodley, like, "Oh, well, you can't mess with us. Like, we'll beat you up." And it's just like, not very likely. So basically, they were not treating Tyron with the proper respect, with the respect befitting a guy who has 5 world championship wins. And so, I think that you have to question at this point, the loyalty. You have to question the character and the loyalty of the people that Jorge is giving his shine to. I mean, Jorge gives Jake Paul the rub a little bit, and then he turns around and disrespects somebody else who's within Jorge's circle. That's not a good look. And given that Jake Paul is out doing pretty much everything that Jorge Masvidal is said to stand against, doing all the things like the trash talking, and then with fighters that he's not going to settle up with, I would have to say that regardless of whether or not the Paul versus Askren gamble paid off for Jorge Masvidal, I would have to say that the association with Jake Paul is definitely not doing great things for his image in the sport. I mean, I'm not out to badmouth him here. I'm still a fan. I do hope, although I will make no predictions, I do hope that he walks out of Jacksonville, Florida as the welterweight champion of the world on Saturday evening. I think that he's going to remain a star in this sport, win, lose, or draw in that fight. But going forward, I think that Jorge Masvidal definitely needs to be paying a lot more attention to some of the other associations that he's making, because they will definitely affect his stardom in the sport.